No one ever remembers the moment before the chandelier light shifted, before the music faltered, before the air in the ballroom thickened with something more dangerous than gossip. It is always the instant of silence that etches itself into memory, the precise heartbeat when every pair of eyes turns toward a single scene unraveling in the glare of grandeur. If you find yourself drawn into that silence, into the chill of a scandal about to ignite, then stay with me. And if stories like this one speak to your sense of justice, betrayal, or secret hungers hidden behind velvet curtains, I invite you to like and subscribe, for there are more truths waiting to be uncovered in ballrooms like these. The sterling grand glittered with polished marble and the scent of imported orchids that night, a gala woven together with the threads of Boston's most formidable families, where fortunes brushed against fortunes and power was measured not in whispered words, but in the tilt of a chin or the flick of a wrist. I had been sent there not as guest, but as observer, a quiet chronicler among the riot of champagne and diamonds, my role to fade into the silk-draped walls while watching the stories beneath the gowns unfold, and none was more compelling than the small figure of Clara Whitmore, her presence so delicate it seemed accidental, as though the widow had stumbled from her modest flat into a world that would devour her whole. Clara wore a dress that carried the scent of mothballs more than perfume, its satin hem borrowed, and its seams betraying the careful hand of a neighbor's needle, and yet her bearing, nervous, yes, but anchored by something honest, gave her an aura that no designer could replicate. She stood near the silent auction table, speaking with tentative hope about her nonprofit for bereaved families, and it was there that Alexander Hale's gaze found her, a gaze so polished and lethal it could still an entire room, though at that moment it was softened by curiosity rather than command. Hale, the billionaire whose empire of shipping and steel spanned continents, carried himself like a man accustomed to storms bending to his will, his jaw carved in the chill of command. But for one fragile instant his attention bent toward Clara as though the gala, the glitter, the heiresses pressing close to him with painted smiles, all of it, ceased to matter, and this single accident of meeting was what lit the fuse of ruin. For watching from across the room, her fingers wrapped around a crystal glass that trembled not from weakness but from suppressed fury, was Vivian Ashford, the heiress, the storm in crimson silk, whose life had been staged on pedestals higher than chandeliers, her smile rehearsed for magazine covers, her future whispered in drawing rooms to be tied seamlessly with Alexander Hale's fortune, and to see Clara, a widow with nothing but borrowed fabric and the weight of grief in her eyes, standing where Vivian believed she alone belonged, was intolerable. I felt the moment shift before anyone else. The orchestra's violins straining just slightly off beat as though the musicians themselves had caught the scent of discord, the ripple of whispers too faint to be words yet unmistakably sharp, and then Vivian moved, her gown slicing through the crowd like blood on snow, each step deliberate, the kind of step that announces an ending. She did not pause, did not smile. She reached Clara with the precision of a hawk, her jeweled hand darting not toward a greeting, but toward the fragile sleeve of that borrowed gown, and with a single wrenching sound, a sound that sliced through violins, laughter, and the soft crackle of champagne bubbles, she tore the seam apart. The fabric gave way like breath itself, the sleeve ripping downward in a jagged scar across satin, exposing the pale line of Clara's shoulder to the air, and with it her humiliation, raw and merciless. Gasps cascaded around the ballroom like falling glass. Fans snapped closed. Conversations froze mid-sentence, and the silence that followed was not the polite hush of society, but the gaping, horrified quiet of witnesses unsure whether they had just seen a performance or a public execution. Clara's face burned crimson, her hands instinctively clutching at the ruined gown, her lips trembling with words she could not yet form. And in that split second, she was the embodiment of every woman who had been told she did not belong, every soul dragged into the light of cruelty simply for daring to exist where power had already claimed its throne. And then, like frost cutting through fire, came the voice that silenced the room. Alexander Hale, stepping forward, his tone as cold as steel drawn from its sheath, the single word enough, echoing not as sound but as law, for when a man like Hale spoke, society did not debate, it obeyed. It was not the kind of enough uttered by weary hosts or indulgent fathers. It was a word honed in boardrooms and battlefields of commerce, a word that carried weight because men and women across oceans had lost fortunes for failing to heed it. And when Alexander Hale's voice cut through the Sterling Grand's glittering hush, the air itself seemed to draw back, as though reluctant to move without his permission. Vivian Ashford's jeweled hand remained frozen in the shredded satin, her breath catching in her throat as if she too had been caught in a vice. And the crowd, once buzzing with curiosity, fell into a silence so sharp I could hear the echo of Clara's shallow breaths. Alexander did not rush forward like a hero from a fable. He stepped with deliberate calm, each movement a declaration of dominion, his tuxedo crisp against the pallor of chandeliers, his presence swelling until it seemed the very marble floor was steady only because he willed it so. When he reached the two women, his gaze locked first on Vivian, and in that gaze lay centuries of aristocratic pride unraveling. For the heiress who had been raised to believe no consequence could touch her now, found herself trembling before a man who commanded not by birthright, but by unyielding control of empires. "Apologize," he said, and though his voice was low, it struck harder than a shout, reverberating against crystal and bone, stripping the heiress of every shield her lineage had bestowed. Vivian's lips parted, the crowd leaning in to hear, but pride clawed at her throat, choking the words. And in that moment of hesitation, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. She, the Ashford heiress, glittering in crimson, was suddenly small, diminished, a figure of pity rather than envy. Clara, meanwhile, clutched her ruined gown to her chest, her wide eyes darting between the heiress who had attacked her and the billionaire who now stood before her like a wall of iron. And though humiliation painted her cheeks, there was something else rising within her gaze, something like defiance, fragile but unbroken, as if Hale's command had not only silenced the room, but also given her permission to breathe. Around us, the orchestra faltered into nothing. Waiters froze mid-step with silver trays poised in the air, and the chandeliers glittered with an almost cruel brightness, illuminating the theater of power unfolding beneath them. The women of society clutched their pearls tighter, their husbands whispered calculations of alliances and ruin, and all eyes bore witness to the heiress forced into submission. Vivian's hand slipped from the fabric as though the satin had burned her, and she stumbled back a single step, her crimson gown rippling like blood in retreat, her voice thin and strained as she finally whispered the word she had never spoken in public to anyone beneath her station. "I'm sorry." It was not apology but survival, torn from her like silk ripped from a gown, and yet it was enough. Enough to cement the narrative that Alexander Hale, not Vivian Ashford, held the room in his grip. He did not acknowledge her surrender beyond a single flicker of his eyes, the kind of dismissal more devastating than fury, for it reduced her to irrelevance in the very hall where she had once reigned supreme. Instead, his attention turned fully toward Clara, and though his gaze softened, there remained an edge of command, as though his concern was not charity but choice, a decision made with cold clarity. Without removing his jacket, he shrugged it from his broad shoulders and placed it around Clara with a precision that allowed no protest. The fabric heavy with the scent of oak and steel, transforming her from object of ridicule into figure of interest, and the crowd exhaled as if the entire city had shifted beneath their feet. In that moment, Clara was no longer a widow in borrowed satin. She was the woman Alexander Hale had chosen to shield, and that choice was worth more than fortunes whispered through estates. Whispers surged anew, this time not cruel but hungry. A speculation ignited like wildfire. Was the billionaire smitten, or was this some calculated blow against the Ashfords, whose empire had long tangled with this? Whatever the truth, it was clear to all who witnessed it that the cold command of Alexander Hale had redrawn the invisible map of power, and every guest in that ballroom left knowing the story they had seen was only the beginning of a war that would ripple through boardrooms, marriages, and family dynasties for months to come. The moment Vivian's reluctant apology fractured the silence, the gala exhaled as though an entire city had held its breath, and yet the air did not return to normal. It thickened, charged with the scent of scandal, that intoxicating perfume society both despised and devoured. Guests shifted in clusters, their jeweled heads bent together, tongues sharp as knives carving the tale that would race across Boston by dawn. The heiress undone, the widow defended, and the billionaire's command, eclipsing centuries of Ashford dominance. Vivian stood trembling, her crimson gown aflame guttering against the cold marble of Alexander Hale's indifference, and though she managed to lift her chin in a parody of dignity, the damage was irreparable. Her fury, usually a weapon polished to glitter, had backfired in the cruelest theater imaginable, and every pair of eyes recorded her humiliation for retelling. Alexander's jacket, draped around Clara, transformed her from victim into symbol, and though she clutched the torn fabric beneath with desperate hands, she could not conceal the way her presence had shifted. Where moments before she had been invisible, now she glowed under the weight of whispered speculation, the reluctant centerpiece of a story she had never sought to star in. I watched her lips part, perhaps to protest, perhaps to flee, but Alexander's subtle tilt of his head, an unspoken command, kept her rooted, and in that stillness, a fragile alliance was born. Clara unwilling, Alexander absolute. The orchestra, trembling from its own silence, stumbled back into a waltz too brittle to soothe the room, and waiters scurried with trays as though speed might erase what had been burned into memory. But the gala was no longer about charity, no longer about jewels or signatures on checks. It was about a power shift witnessed by Boston's most ruthless eyes. I noted the way old men stroked their mustaches thoughtfully, calculating how Hale's dismissal of Vivian might signal cracks in the centuries-old Hale. Ashford understanding. I saw matrons press jeweled hands against their pearls, as if scandal might leap from Clara's bare shoulder to stain their own reputations. And most of all, I saw Vivian's eyes, smoldering with a hatred so sharp it promised that tonight was not her ruin, but her vow. She withdrew slowly, each step like glass underfoot, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a wound across marble. And though she carried herself with a dancer's poise, the hush that followed her exit was damning. No one moved to console her, no one reached to soften her shame, for Vivian Ashford had crossed a line that no lineage could redraw. In contrast, Clara seemed paralyzed beneath the weight of Hale's jacket, her eyes darting to the doors as if seeking escape, but Alexander remained beside her, his profile as carved and distant as a statue, not touching her, not speaking further, but making clear by his very proximity that she stood under his shadow now. For Clara, the cost of survival tonight was entanglement. For Vivian, the cost of pride was exile. By the time the gala sputtered back to its glittering rhythm, the future had already shifted. The Ashford name would tremble under rumor, the Hale empire would rise sharper with speculation, and Clara Whitmore, widow, outsider, uninvited guest in borrowed satin, would wake tomorrow in a world where her life no longer belonged to her alone. As I slipped among the guests, hearing fragments of whispered judgments. Did you see the way Hale looked at her? The Ashfords are finished if he withdraws support. That poor girl, or clever girl, depending on what she does next. I understood that this story had only begun, for society does not forgive, it feeds, and what had been torn tonight was not just a dress, but the fragile veil between power and ruin. And though the chandeliers continued to glitter, though champagne still flowed, though violins reclaimed their waltz, every soul who had witnessed Alexander Hale's cold command knew that the true music of the evening was not the orchestra, but the unspoken question thrumming through every heartbeat. What will happen now, when pride, power, and vengeance clash not behind curtains, but beneath the unflinching gaze of a world hungry for scandal?